Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 18th episode of the Experience Talk podcast. And today we will be talking about embedding voice of customer data in contact center. I'm NK, head of customer experience at Service Sensum, and I'm delighted to host today a corporate CX influencer, leader, speaker, author, and a consultant, Michael himself with us. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you today doing?
Hello, NK. I'm doing great. Thanks. Thanks for having me on and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. And before we just start to deep dive into our conversations, I just wanted if you can share a little bit about yourself to our audience, Michael.
Sure. Um, Michael Hinshaw. I'm the founder and president of MCorp CX. We're a San Francisco-based management consulting firm that has been around for about 20 years, and we only help organizations with customer experience improvement, specifically things like building internal capabilities, improving customer journeys and experiences, helping to define measurement systems and identify technologies that help organizations to better understand their customers and deliver the services their customers desire. So, thanks.
Yeah, awesome. I think it's gonna be fun to know in deep dive and understanding. Take your learnings about your contact center experience, Michael. So I think let's get started with our first question. And I think we want to understand how do you adopt a voice of customer data inside the contact center, Michael?
Yeah, there's a number of different ways to do that. Essentially, whether it's in the contact center or any part of the organization, the real challenge is twofold. The first is, how do you use the interactions that agents have with customers to gather information about those customers' experiences, and then utilize that data to improve the experience that both the contact center and other parts of the organization provide. The second part is related to that, which is using the data to help agents do a better job delivering the experiences to customers that customers desire. So that can take place in a number of different ways. It can take place by segment or customer type or product group, so larger groups of data that indicate behaviors that the entire contact center should potentially adopt. It could also be customer specific, where you're solving specific problems that individual customers have. But being able to see, access, and leverage that data is the challenge that most organizations have.
Absolutely. I think I agree with you that there's so much of variation of data available in specifically in the contact center when we try to merge with the voice of customer at the large, right? But if I have to ask you that if when you start moving your data and provide a holistic view of voice of customer, what was your like first step to get this started and how did you get this started?
Yeah, the first thing is having a system in place, a framework essentially that allows you to gather and analyze the data. And today, most organizations have lots and lots and lots of data. They don't have many insights.
Agree.
So the challenge is, how do you, to your point, get started? And you can get started simply there, whether it's just a simple, customer satisfaction survey, or a question that follows up after an interaction or transaction. Or it might be something that the agent themselves ask the customer to better understand, and then use that data to feed back into the broader system. But as they say, a journey of a thousand miles begins with a single step. With any type of customer information, customer experience improvement initiative, it's the same thing. It's taking that first step and doing so mindfully, right? Because my dad had an aphorism when I was young. He had a lot of these. He said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there.
Absolutely.
You need to have a clear understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish. So just asking customers for information and not acting on it and not using it, you're better off not doing anything.
Absolutely, I agree with you. On this, like as you rightly said, there's so much of data available already, right? Before the customer is actually trying to contact the contact center, right? So, like, what do you see that is is the listening to the omni-channel data already available in social media? Does it also helps contact center, like providing this to the greater insight overall, or it is just the data that we get from the customer when they reach out or try to contact the agents?
Yeah, it's not a one or the other. It's within the framework of your desire to better understand your customers and your strategy around, as we talked about earlier, leveraging that information.
Mm-hmm.
So social, absolutely. You can do a lot of social listening to understand groups of customers. You can also use social listening to identify individual customer problems, combining that with other sources of information, whether agent directed, survey directed, or pulling information from your systems, telemetry data, what customers actually do, and understanding that in the context of what customers say they want and do. Sometimes those are different things. Being able to correlate and understand those differences will do a significantly greater job than just listening to one channel or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just one question came up to my mind when we look at our data of customers on the social media point of view, right? So there are so much of influencers also available, and there is a competition also, right? So if I'm a brand, there is a lot of people who talk about those brands positive and negative. So
Mm-hmm.
if you are designing an experience the organization, how do you eliminate like a gambling or like a gamification of those type of conversations that is happening on the social media? How do you know that it's a genuine feedback or like not so genuine? Then how you give consideration to those type of feedback to the organization, Michael?
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly, and I might not, so let me know if I'm answering the
Sure,
question you
sure.
asked. But we understand the importance of the competitive market space
Yeah,
and what people are saying about your organization in the context of what they're saying about competitors. But in general, what we found to be more relevant is for companies to listen to the information that's specifically about them. Essentially, if you put your customers first, and if you worry about what your customers want, think, feel, need, and do, the competition will essentially take care of itself. I don't mean to be glib. I know that the competitive marketplace is very difficult. Virtually every organization has multiple competitors, both large, well-established, as well as small, fast-moving startups. And the reality is that our point of view is that if you do a great job delivering the experiences and services your customers want, you're going to do a better job than your competitors. The reality is you have the ability to learn more about your customers than any competitive organization does. Back to this first question you asked, where do you start? Well, you start with a plan. And
yeah,
if that plan is based on understanding your customers better than anyone else, and then serving them better than anyone else based on that knowledge, you're going to win. If you constantly
absolutely.
look at what others are doing, right, you're going to spend all your time looking at what others are doing. What about what you're doing? So,
Agree. And now I think like you said it very rightly, but I think I would say that in the actual deployment of this strategy, right? When organization has to deploy this strategy, it's not that easy. So I want to understand from you that when you deploy certain strategies in the organization, right? What are the challenges is being faced during the adoption of it?
yeah, there's probably three major areas of challenge. The first is, and is probably the biggest, which is cultural. I say cultural means it's change, using information to change the way that people work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a significant cultural shift for most call centers and most organizations all up. And what that also, when I say cultural, it's not just how the agents feel, it's how they're rewarded and compensated. So if you tell your agents, your call center teams that customer satisfaction, just for example, is really important to us, but you don't have any metrics, performance metrics around satisfaction, if the performance metrics are all around call time or length of time on phone or whatever those specific things, operational metrics might be, then your agents are going to ignore all the satisfaction stuff because they're not being measured or rewarded on it. So cultural is a big one, and that cultural flows both ways. Agents need to know that they have permission to deliver the experiences that the organization says that it wants to deliver, but at the same time, the organization has to actually reward them for doing that, right? And that's a big shift, particularly in call centers. The second area is in processes. And these aren't in priority order, by the way. They're both, all three of these are, depending on the company, One might be primary, another secondary, another tertiary, and they could reverse entirely in another business. But when I say processes, it's how do you use information in the organization? Do you use that information to make decisions throughout the company, only part of a company? Do you have a process for determining, how you get information about a particular customer's problem versus, groups of problems that are common that you can solve with a big fix? And the third area is really technology and data handling related. What tools do you use to gather it? So gathering the data appropriately, using the appropriate tech and data warehouses, platforms, analysis, et cetera, to do that. Processes to appropriately manage that data internally and then use it to make decisions. And then again, back to the first one we talked about, which is how do you actually use that to drive change in the organization, resulting in better customer experiences, happier customers, and a better competitive performance in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think I think I totally resonate this problem, because when we also work with the contact center to understand their omni-channel presence. I think the first thing is the cultural benefit and cultural change, and I think most of the time we see a variance in that, right? And where we are like, if you have a contact center and a global company, then there is a diversity into a different culture also, right? So if you are like surveying for a contact center that has a different region, and different regions have a different culture, does it has any impact on your processes, Michael?
Yeah, it absolutely can. It doesn't necessarily have to. In most call centers that we've worked in, or most service centers, customers don't necessarily get to choose, and it's not always easy to determine how calls are routed. Or when I say calls, right?
Yeah.
In an omni-channel contact center, calls are just one of the channels, right? It could be calls, social, email, chat, etc. But the routing of those inquiries, those requests, those interactions to the right, when I say the right, to the most culturally relevant agents is a difficult task for even global organizations to do.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think like I have my personal experience, like if you are like having one culture presence, like specifically for, if a German gets like received a call from an American, like the way they speak is different, right? So it does it, like for organization, it matters most to match up the most relevant like way to cater those customers, so that they're more like understanding their personal culture to answer their feedback in their.
We actually, yeah. So we typically don't look at it from the perspective, only because there are so many different cultural nuances. It's very, and again, matching cultural nuance to, customer. I mean, somebody could be living in Germany, but have moved there from India or China or any, so it's very, again, difficult to figure out that cultural piece. What is common are, kind of core communication styles. And you can train agents to understand their own communication styles. There's something called the Merrill model that essentially allows you to assess whether you're somebody who asks a lot of questions, for example, or somebody who tells stories. There's 4 major components to it. And if you recognize your communication style as an agent, and you're able to recognize the communication style of your customer, it's called essentially style shifting. So you adopt your style to match the style of the caller. And that's a universal. It's not, US versus Germany versus wherever else. It's a human, right? We as humans communicate in, 4 primary ways. There are many others, obviously, but simplistically, when you look at it for, driving change inside the call center, you want to make it as easy to understand as possible. So being able to match communication styles, we found to be much more effective than trying to match, cultural backgrounds, because it's very difficult to understand, what those cultural backgrounds actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like, so you would say that humanizing the experience would take care of this if we focus our agents to train them more on humanizing the experience as compared to the regional or like local processes.
Yes, and that's a great phrase, humanizing the experience. And there's a couple of components to that. Communication style is one of those. Another is empathy. It's being able to put yourself in the shoes of your customer to understand where they're coming from. It's, active listening, actually hearing what your customers are saying. Oftentimes, traditional call centers, I say traditional, right? I recognize there's not necessarily any such thing, but more typically, call center agents are dealing with a large volume of inquiries. They're compensated or measured or both on how quickly they get through those calls. Many times they don't take the time to listen to customers necessarily. And the thing that's ironic is when you listen, you're able to better solve customer problems more quickly. So listening does not necessarily take more time. In fact, listening can often take less time because listening and responding correctly to begin with allows you to avoid escalations, for example, avoid transfers to supervisors, avoid all those things that end up costing, call centers a lot of money. So maybe you take a little bit more time on an individual call or at the beginning of an individual call, but that also puts you in a position as an agent where you can better solve the customer problem in a way that aligns with customers' expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great insight, Michael, about like how we can bring in the agents and what are the key things that we need to focus on in respective of managing the customer expectation. Now I'm just going to take a step back and relate this to the question where you said that there's a lot of metrics available in the contact center that an agent has to look at it, and also like there has to be something that why agents should perform well, right? There is an incentive mechanism system, right?
Mhm.
Specifically in contact center to provide to do a better job for themselves. So like how do you, like if you have a large contact center, then how do you bring in your like agents, team members to perform to the goal of a BOC? So if the CSAT is one of the goal to provide a great customer experience, then how do you get your agents and leaders imbibed and adopt this strategy within themselves, and how they can own it, maybe, if I ask in simple way.
Yeah. So first, I just want to, full disclosure, I don't consider myself a contact center expert in any way, shape, or form. All right, we do a lot of work with contact centers. We also do a lot of work with sales, with marketing, with operations. So my answer is going to apply equally to any organization that's trying to bring voice of the customer into their operations, and contact center obviously being one of those areas.
Absolutely.
And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but one of the biggest issues is support for what the agents are actually what the agents need to do to deliver against essentially the promise of the organization, what the organization is telling their customers they'll deliver. And there's a lot of that's going to be driven by management's willingness to give their people some ability to respond based on what those individuals think is best. So in the world of customer centricity, super scripted, calls where the agent has to go through the screen and say, if the customer says this, this, or this,
Yep.
then these are my only 4 available responses. That essentially shuts down and eliminates the ability of an agent to actually deliver, in a human way. And we like to think of the kinds of things organizations who are successful at this do is like setting up bumper rails in a bowling alley that essentially allow within strictly defined guidelines and give the agents essentially full license to do what they think best for the customer, provided they do it within this particular framework. So it's both freeing to the agent, but it's also very difficult for traditional call center and other parts of the organization that feel the need to control, particularly in an agent environment. But we've seen the companies that give more kind of that allow their agents to be more self-directed have lower turnover. Again, back to the cost side, right? Most call centers have really high turnover. And a lot of that's because, if you're just in there, if you feel like you're a cog in a machine, if you're only allowed to ask this question or this answer and you have no ability whatsoever to actually solve the customer's problem, and that's how it feels, people leave because it's frustrating, right? None of us want to go into a job where we don't feel we're adding value. The vast majority of people, I don't, you don't, and I suspect that anybody working in a call center wants to feel like they're doing something useful. So you got to give them the framework to do that. And that's hard for organizations to adopt. And kind of going back to what's the biggest challenge for integrating it, it's actually the company putting the systems in place that allow their people to deliver against that.
Yeah, and I think like rightly said, I think I understand that that is one of the reason if it is not done right, then we often see there is a high churn rate for the agent in the contact center. And if we want to manage that, I think we should focus on these areas so that agents feel empowered, are able to take their own decisions to delight the customer. So I think I really look at the way you think, Michael. I think it's all on
Yeah,
spot. Yeah. Um,
it's ironic, right? Because in
yeah.
a call
Yeah.
center, in many cases, the call center's job is to solve customer problems in a way that retain those customers. But if they're not helping agents
Yeah.
do that in a way that allow them to be self-directed, then they're going to be losing agents, and that's going to end up costing a lot of
Yeah.
money.
Agree. And I think let's say that how do you make agents to own the feedback? So if customer is speaking to the agent and there is any feedback they receive,
Mhm.
and the agent has does agent has ability to close the loop by themselves, or how do we make sure that agent take ownership to close the loop with the customers?
There's I guess a couple things related to that. The first, so there's a couple different categories of this, right? One is, we say the agent owning the feedback. I see that as a different thing than the agent closing the loop.
Hmm.
So let's talk about closing the loop first. Closing the loop is where a customer has an issue. Maybe it's an issue that happened elsewhere in the organization. The agent needs to have the ability to solve that customer's problem in a way that satisfies customer and meets that customer's expectations. So again, back to being self-directed, back to having agency, the ability to make decisions that are in the best interest of the customer. All of those things are, policies, procedures, essentially cultural elements, so to speak, that empower the agents. Owning the feedback, so I'll kind of set that to one side. So owning the feedback is, and I consider this like feedback about an individual agent's performance.
Yeah.
So, owning that feedback essentially means if a customer is dissatisfied with a call, if a customer is unhappy with the resolution, if the customer, is angry or upset or all those things. And this goes back to kind of the culture piece of it. In many organizations, that kind of feedback is looked at as failure,
Yeah.
with a capital F. You failed. You upset our customer. If we look at failure as learning rather than as failure, that attitude in the organization empowers agents and gives them the ability to learn. If you tell someone that they're bad, they're going to feel bad. If you tell someone, hey, you know what, we can improve. This isn't an indication of the sum total of your experience, right? You are not a failure. You're learning. You're in learning mode. Essentially, it's a growth mindset. It's looking, and you think about a growth mindset, it's not a fixed point. You don't go from kind of a closed mindset to a growth mindset, and
Yeah.
you don't live on one place in that continuum. But the ability to say, hey, I can learn from this. I'm curious. What can I do differently? What can I do better? But that attitude is not only important at the agent level, it's also something the organization has to encourage, promote, and support.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you have said, like I would say the golden bullet points for any contact center, or maybe like it is actually for any of the organization, right? Who actually allowed their employees to fail, right? So we encourage you to fail, because when you fail, it's not failure; it's actually a learning curve, right?
No.
So I think, yeah, I think this is the golden line that I picked up from you. So thank you so much for sharing your insights,
Well,
Michael, on this.
there's for anyone who's listening to this, Mark Coopersmith, who's a friend and a colleague at UC Berkeley, where I'm a teaching fellow in entrepreneurship and innovation in the business school there. Mark
Mhm.
Coopersmith wrote a book with his co-author John Danner called The Other F Word, and the other F word is failure. So it's a great read if anyone's interested in checking that out, learning more about how organizations can actually use failure as a tool to learn and move forward, rather than as a judgment for where somebody ends up at a particular point in time.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much. But I think I'm gonna add this to my list as well. So thank you so much for recommending that as well, Michael. So that's a great. I'm just so because the agent has so much to say, and I think somewhere like the failure, like you said, like if the agent has shy away that if I'm gonna fail, what happened if the customer is angry, and they consider it as a failure for themselves, and this is actually a kind of voice of agents, right? So
Mhm.
like, do you see that there is any framework where agents can share their voice in the contact center, and what would you recommend for like, and what you have seen for your organization that you have worked with, Michael?
Yeah, there's formal and informal structures. Let's talk about formal structures, data-driven structures. Those are places where you have a metrics or data gathering or voice of the agent system in place. It probably feeds into the same data store, probably uses the same tools you're using for voice of the customer. And then similarly to voice of the customer, you want to have a closed loop where you have the ability to identify issues that individual agents are having, as well as issues that multiple agents are having that the organization can solve for a bigger problem. So those are some of the more formal structures, and again, utilize the same listening tools internally as you do externally in most cases. Informal structure includes things like essentially groups of agents working together, essentially customer teams or informal gatherings. We've seen a couple of companies we work with have groups of customer advocates within the contact center, and those customer or those experience advocates, they essentially bring together groups. They share best practices. They share things they've learned. They do so in both formal and informal settings. Formal settings being, for example, a webcast or a panel conversation for the entire organization to watch. Informal being coaching, right? And these aren't necessarily the supervisors. These are the agents that are, the rock stars essentially in that organization that are passionate about the customer, that understand customer issues, that can mentor and train other agents internally. So those kind of informal structures combined with formal structures allow the entire organization to up level when it comes to delivering great experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just wanted to check with you, Michael, that what if you can share an example of one of your best experience that ever you have got from a contact center, and if you can share that example with our audience today.
Oh, sadly, not not a long list. Um, yeah, I have a story that I tell about contact centers. It's not necessarily a contact center issue, but is an
Yeah.
organizational issue. So I'm flipping this around on you because it's
Yeah,
a difficult,
absolutely. So I think
right?
if you said right, I think you're very right to say that is it not contact center issue, but it is an organizational issue, because I don't see if there is an issue, it depends upon any specific department or any individual employee, but it's the culture or it's the way how an organization led people to behave in a certain situation, right? If they have a better control or different processes and in their organization, probably we can control a lot of issues. So I'm happy to
Yeah.
hear that, and just to get more insights out of this, Michael.
I mean, the reality is in virtually every contact center, what rolls downhill,
Yeah,
right? So the contact center is the one dealing with the expectations that have been set by marketing, by sales, by operations, retail, physical stores, whatever the organization is doing. Customers are satisfied or dissatisfied at different places along their journey. By the time they get to the contact center, they generally have a problem they need to get solved. Sometimes they come in with a positive attitude. Sometimes they come in with a negative attitude. And the ability, again, back to our earlier conversation, to listen, to understand, to figure out what customer expectations are, and then be transparent when you're communicating with them. Be optimistic but realistic, right? So transparency means you're not going to
yeah,
lie to them. You're going to tell them what's actually going on. You're going to let them, if you only have limited power to solve their problem, you tell them, and then you tell them what you're going to do about it, right? So optimistic but realistic. I don't have authority to do this, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to talk to my boss, and he's got the authority. I don't know what he's going to say, but right. So those are the kinds of things that create rapport that help customers understand. But going back to the organizational question, I'm sure that wherever you are in the world, the same experience that I have here in the U.S. when I rarely call a contact center because I frankly don't have have time to do that most of the time.
Right.
But when you do call, like in the US, to say internet provider or a phone company, one of the first things they ask you is to enter in your account number or your phone number, some kind of personally identifiable information so they can route you correctly. So you dig that information up, you type it in, and then you go through the voice tree, and you finally end up after some length of time with an agent. Invariably, what's the first thing that agent asks you? They say, what's your phone number? What's your account number? And for me personally, that kind of thing makes me nuts. It's like, I just entered that in. Obviously, your systems aren't talking to each other. And there's only two possible answers. One, you're incompetent. And two, you don't care about me or respect my time. So those kinds of things that are, to your point, organizational issues, create problems for agents that are solvable long before it gets to the agent, right? So little things that are annoyances that are friction points. So how do you as an organization identify and eliminate friction wherever possible, knowing that the better job you do with that, the easier it's going to be for your agents to solve the problems your customer started with.
Awesome. I think it's a great insight, Michael. I think either the technology can help or the processes. And if it downs towards the agent, then probably it's a more of a training resource, giving them empowerment to behave, like to provide a great customer experience.
Yeah.
I think just to interest of time, I think we're almost at the end of the conversation today. But I just wanted to share. I just wanted to ask you, Michael, if there is anything specific that you want to share with our audience who are actually uh, starting like a small contact center. So what are the key priorities they should focus on?
Mhm. I'd say, set realistic boundaries for your agents. When I say realistic boundaries, you want to put things in place that will give them the ability to solve customer problems, but not do so in a way that's going to be negative for your business.
Mhm.
It's essentially not over controlling your agents, but giving them enough room to solve the problems that customers have. And that control issue is probably one of the biggest ones that we see in organizations that are starting up. They want to control every single aspect. They want to script everything. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I'd start at the very beginning by making a voice of the customer part of your rhythm of business. So as you start up or scale a contact center, it's much easier to bring voice of the customer into your processes at the beginning than it is to drive them through at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for your sound bites today. And we appreciate all the time today. And I'm sure that our listeners will have more questions to you. So please watch for this to go live, and then we'll have more discussion on this as well, Michael.
Great. NK, absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for your time and enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for listening in. We will be again next week with another interesting topic and an awesome CX influencer. Thank you once again, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you so much.